The Cold War is usually sold as a contest of ideology and missiles. The ledger suggests something colder. The Soviet Union did not lose because it lacked rockets. It lost because it needed dollars. It sold oil to buy grain, and by the early 1980s, nearly half of its hard currency went to food imports. Then oil prices collapsed, and the state replaced revenue with loans and printed rubles. That is not policy failure. It is incentive success, and it ends the same way every time. On December 25th, 1991, the red flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. The camera angle the world remembers is political. A president resigning, a state dissolving, crowds watching history move. But if you could have stepped past the ceremony and into the quiet rooms where the accounts were kept, you would have found a simpler ending. The kind that does not care about speeches. The kind that arrives without drama, then rewrites everything. The state could no longer settle its obligations. It could no longer pay, not in promises, not in rubles, and not in anything the outside world accepted as money. So the Soviet Union did what every insolvent institution eventually does. It stopped being real. This story is not primarily about betrayal or courage. It is about a structure that confused revenue with strength. It is about a country that looked permanent because it had tanks, satellites, and a nuclear arsenal measured in tens of thousands. Yet it lived on a thinner substance: hard currency, dollars, gold, the instruments that could purchase wheat, machines, spare parts, and silence in global markets. Inside its borders, the ruble could command labor because the state demanded it. Outside its borders, the ruble was a rumor. You could not buy American grain with a rumor. You could not purchase German equipment with ideology. You needed settlement. You needed something the other side could bank. That is the paradox that pulls the entire collapse into focus. A superpower can possess absolute coercion and still be financially cornered. It can deploy divisions across continents and still depend on a weekly shipment of grain. It can dominate headlines and still fear a number that flickers on a trading screen in London. When that number falls, the missiles do not matter, the slogans do not matter. Even loyalty begins to look like a luxury. To understand how the Soviet Union reached that edge, you have to go back to the moment it believed it had escaped scarcity. The mid-1960s did not feel like an era of impending bankruptcy. It felt like a discovery. In Western Siberia, in a landscape where winter does not negotiate, Soviet geologists struck oil on a scale that reshaped the 20th century. It was not simply a field, it was a new foundation, a sea of exportable value, buried under ice and distance, waiting for pipes and rigs and a global price. In the decades that followed, the world handed the Soviet state a gift wrapped as a crisis. In the 1970s, oil prices surged after geopolitical shocks in the Middle East and the West confrontation with OPEC. For consumers, it was a panic. For Moscow, it was an opening. Billions in hard currency poured in. The Soviet Union could sell what it had in abundance and buy what it struggled to produce. It could import machinery instead of reinventing it. It could import food instead of fixing farms. It could finance subsidies that kept households calm. And it could finance a military posture that signaled permanence. This is the first quiet mechanism. Easy money does not just fund a system. It rewrites the incentives inside that system. When revenue arrives without reform, reform becomes optional. When social peace can be purchased with subsidies, accountability becomes cosmetic. When elites can distribute cheap bread, cheap rent, and cheap energy, they can postpone the dangerous work of rebuilding institutions that actually produce value. Oil did not merely fill the treasury, it anesthetized the diagnosis. Over time, the structure hardened into something that looked stable from the outside and fragile from within. The Soviet economy increasingly resembled a raw material exporter with an advanced military. It traded commodities outward and pulled finished goods inward. It sold oil and bought machines. It sold oil and bought grain. It sold oil and used the proceeds to hold together an empire of commitments, including subsidies at home and support for allied regimes abroad. None of these decisions were irrational in isolation. They were, at the time, exactly what the system rewarded. Stability first, control first, delay the political cost of reform until later. Later arrived anyway. The second mechanism is dependency that hides inside routine. Soviet agriculture, despite fertile land and enormous labor input, did not reliably feed the country. Collective systems produced waste at scale, harvest spoiled before distribution. Logistics broke under bureaucracy. The result was not just empty shelves, it was an import bill. Millions of tons of grain had to be purchased from abroad, including from the very rival the Soviet project was built to oppose. That transaction carried its own humiliation, but humiliation was not the real threat. The threat was arithmetic. Grain had to be paid for in dollars or gold, and those dollars increasingly came from a single stream. Oil became the stream. Oil became the assumption behind every plan, every subsidy, every geopolitical posture, every promise that the state made to its people and to its clients. As long as oil stayed high, the machine could run. The leadership could treat structural dysfunction as a manageable inconvenience. It could treat the future as something to be negotiated later. Then the external environment changed, as it always does. The West became more energy efficient. New production came online from places like the North Sea and Alaska. Demand softened, supply rose, prices began to wobble. At the same time, the Soviet state was still paying for a war in Afghanistan, still funding allies, still feeding a military apparatus that consumed roughly a fifth of national output, and still purchasing grain. The obligations were fixed. The revenue was not. When Mikhail Gorbachev enters the Kremlin in 1985, the story is often told as a political experiment that ran too far. The ledger tells a different story. He inherits an economy that has been living on a commodity premium and calling it resilience. He arrives with a modernization plan and a belief that investment can restart productivity. In another context, it might have been a rational bet, but his plan depends on cash, and the cash depends on oil. In September 1985, Saudi Arabia changes course and increases production, pushing prices down. Within a short window, oil falls from the heights near $35 a barrel to levels near 10. For a state whose stability is priced in barrels, this is not a downturn. It is an income shock. It is the equivalent of losing half a salary while keeping the mortgage, the groceries, and the entire geopolitical lifestyle. This is where the trap reveals itself. If you cut military spending, you risk losing the coercive backbone of the state. If you cut food subsidies, you risk losing the social contract that kept people quiet. If you cut support for allies, you risk watching the empire unravel. Every lever carries a political cost. So the state reaches for the lever that seems least visible in the short term. Borrowing. Western banks lend. They lend because the borrower is a superpower. They lend because they see gold reserves and assume continuity. They lend because the alternative is unthinkable, and finance has a habit of treating the unthinkable as impossible until the day it happens. But the crucial detail is how the money is used. Much of it is not invested to build an export engine that could repay the debt. It is used to keep shelves from looking like an indictment. It is used to maintain appearances while the underlying productivity continues to decay. And then, under pressure, the state undermines itself again. The anti-alcohol campaign is launched as a moral intervention and a public health effort. Yet vodka taxes are a major revenue source. Restrict the sales, and you remove a pillar of the budget. People continue drinking through moonshine. The state loses revenue. Shortages spread through unexpected channels as basic inputs are diverted. The system loses another stream of predictable cash at the worst possible moment. By the late 1980s, the Soviet state is not just short of money. It is short of trust. It prints rubles to cover wages, but goods do not appear. Cash accumulates in households without purchasing power, a monetary overhang that turns money into frustration. Lines lengthen. The simplest act, buying bread, becomes a daily negotiation with time and uncertainty. The social contract that traded political obedience for stability begins to fail in public, in full view. When the political center weakens, the financial center collapses faster. Republics begin withholding tax revenue. The state becomes a government of obligations without income. It can command nuclear weapons, yet it cannot guarantee a payroll. It can threaten the world, yet it cannot clear a payment for a ship waiting at the docks. That is the beginning of the end, not ideology collapsing in the streets, but settlement collapsing in the accounts. And once you see it that way, the final image changes. The flag comes down because the checks stop clearing. A state is not only a border and an anthem, it is a payment system. When that system fails, everything else becomes performance. Once a government cannot clear payments, it starts making decisions that look irrational from the outside and perfectly logical from inside a burning room. You do not ask what the ideal future is. You ask what can be postponed until next week. You ask which promise can be broken quietly. You ask which asset can be sold without anyone noticing. For the Soviet Union, the assets that still spoke a language the world understood were limited. Oil, gold, a few export contracts, and the last remaining credibility of a state that had never admitted weakness. As the hard currency gap widened, the country began liquidating the one reserve that was supposed to be untouchable. Gold bars moved out of vaults and into the hands of buyers and financial capitals. In panic selling, you do not get fair prices. You get relief. You get one more shipment paid, one more month purchased. The tragedy is that even the act of selling can harm you. When you dump too much too quickly, you push the price down and you receive less for the same desperation. The reserve that was meant to anchor stability becomes fuel thrown into a fire. At the same time, the external architecture that once made the Soviet sphere look strong began to turn into a bill coming due. For decades, Moscow had managed Eastern Europe through a controlled trading loop. Goods and commitments moved within a system where the rules were political and the terms were imposed. Then the wall fell. The satellite states broke free and the outside world celebrated it as liberation. It was liberation. It was also a financial rupture. Those countries no longer accepted the old terms. They demanded payment in real money for real goods. The closed loop opened into global markets, and in global markets, sentiment does not care what you were yesterday. It cares whether you can settle today. Inside Moscow, every constraint tightened at once. The war in Afghanistan still drained resources. Support for client states still required cash. Military commitments still consumed a brutal share of output. Grain ships still arrived demanding dollars or gold. Meanwhile, the West became more attentive to the Soviet balance sheet. Banks do not panic on ideals. They panic on patterns. They saw borrowing that was being used to cover interest. They saw debt expanding rapidly. They saw a borrower that seemed to be using tomorrow's credibility to buy today's calm. This is how solvency disappears. It rarely announces itself. It erodes quietly, then suddenly becomes visible in places that cannot be hidden. Payments delayed, cargo withheld, counterparties demanding cash in advance, contracts rewritten. In 1990, the unthinkable began to occur. The Soviet state started defaulting on commercial payments, not always as a headline default, not always as a public announcement, often as a practical refusal of the world to keep delivering goods on trust. Ships carrying food would not unload until the money cleared. The problem was that the money did not clear. This is the point where a command economy meets the limits of command. You can order a factory to meet a target, even if the target is absurd. You can order a newspaper to print optimism. You can order a ministry to rewrite statistics. You cannot order a foreign supplier to accept a currency it cannot use. You cannot order a bank in another country to ignore risk forever. You cannot coerce settlement across borders without something the other side values. So the state reached inward. When the central authorities began seizing hard currency from within the system, the collapse accelerated from crisis into disintegration. Enterprises that had earned dollars through trade woke up to find their accounts frozen or emptied. The state redirected these funds to service national obligations. In the logic of emergency, it made sense. The national debt had to be paid, food had to be bought, the center had to keep breathing. In the logic of an economy, it was fatal. Because the moment an exporting entity learns that success leads to confiscation, success stops being a goal. Trust turns into fear. Fear turns into concealment. Concealment turns into a black market. The ruble, already weakened by shortages and printing, began to lose the final property that makes money money, belief that it will still mean something tomorrow. When belief breaks, the economy does not simply slow, it mutates. It moves into barter. Factories pay workers with whatever they produce, not because it is fair, but because it is tangible. Tires, glassware, anything that can be exchanged for potatoes. People become their own logistics networks, standing on roadsides and in improvised markets, trying to convert industrial outputs into food. In that environment, the new elite is not the scientist or the planner. It is the person closest to hard currency. Dollars become the only stable unit of account. The black market becomes the only reliable market. This is not because people suddenly became immoral. It is because the formal system stopped functioning. Incentives reassigned status with ruthless speed. Now the political center was trying to hold a country together without the one tool that makes governance sustainable. Reliable revenue. Republics withheld taxes. Local leaders realized they could keep money at home and gain leverage against Moscow. Boris Yeltsin, leading the Russian Republic, pushed the logic further. If the center cannot deliver stability, why keep feeding it? The more revenue stayed in the republics, the weaker the center became. The weaker the center became, the more rational it was for republics to hold back. It is a feedback loop that looks like politics and operates like finance. Then came August 1991. Hardliners attempted a coup to restore order. Tanks appeared in Red Square. The gesture was pure 20th century power. Steel, force, control. But force cannot reverse insolvency. You can seize a building. You cannot seize a global oil price. You can arrest a rival. You cannot arrest the deficit. You can silence a crowd. You cannot silence unpaid obligations stacking up in foreign banks. The coup failed, and not only because citizens resisted, it failed because the plotters had no credible path back to solvency. They were fighting over authority in a state whose underlying operating system had already crashed. When Gorbachev returned, he returned into emptiness. The office still existed. The state still had weapons. The center no longer had the cash flow that makes a center real. Outside, creditors watched the fragmentation with fear. The Soviet Union had accumulated debts approaching $70 billion. If the country broke apart, who owed what? Which republic would sign? Which republic would inherit the obligation to pay for a past it did not fully control? Creditors demanded an agreement that the debt would not evaporate into the fog of sovereignty. They did not need ideology. They needed signatures. By the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed in paperwork more than in practice. Payroll could not be met. The presses ran continuously producing larger denomination notes that bought less each week. Inflation surged, and the ruble's last remaining credibility dissolved. And when a central bank runs out of reserves and out of trust at the same time, the outcome is not debate. It is termination. When the flag finally came down, it was the public ritual of a private failure. The inability to pay had become the inability to rule. By December 1991, the Soviet state was no longer failing in theory. It was failing in the mundane places where authority is supposed to feel automatic. Salaries arrived late, or not at all. Factories kept operating because stopping felt worse than producing useless inventory. Ministries issued orders that traveled through a country that had begun to treat paper as fiction. In the end, the most important institution in the system was not the party apparatus or the security services. It was the payment mechanism that made the entire structure legible to itself. When the central bank reached insolvency, the language of control stopped translating into reality. Later investigators would try to quantify what was left. The myth of limitless reserves collapsed into a smaller, harsher number. Vaults that were rumored to hold a mountain of gold held only a fraction. The rest had been sold into markets, siphoned into shadows, or burned in the attempt to keep an unpayable system alive for one more week. It is difficult to overstate what that means in state terms. Gold is not merely an asset. It is credibility in physical form. When you spend it, you are not purchasing goods. You are purchasing time. And time, once purchased, comes with interest. So when Gorbachev signed his resignation, it was not a surrender to an invading army. It was a recognition that his administration could not perform the essential act that separates a state from a collapsing organization. It could not settle its obligations. The office remained, the history remained, the weapons remained, the solvency did not. What followed looked like a new era, but financially it was an aftershock. The Soviet Union vanished and something else inherited its bills. Creditors did not accept metaphors. They accepted counterparties. They needed one entity that could be held responsible for a debt accumulated by a state that no longer existed. In the end, the Russian Federation took the seat the Soviet Union once held at the United Nations, took custody of the nuclear codes, and accepted responsibility for the foreign debt. This arrangement is framed in the transcript as a zero-option deal. Russia assumed the liabilities, and in return claimed the foreign assets, embassies, and what remained in reserves. It was a trade that looked like consolidation and felt like suffocation. Because the debt did not disappear when the flag came down. It stayed in the ledger, it stayed in the interest schedule, it stayed in the weekly decisions of a government that was suddenly trying to build legitimacy without the cushion that had purchased calm for decades. In the Soviet model, stability was subsidized. In the new Russian model, the subsidies became unaffordable, and the consequences arrived at household level. This is where a second paradox emerges. The 1990s are often described as the painful cost of transition, as if the hardship is the price of democracy or the chaos of freedom. The ledger suggests a more mechanical explanation. The state that replaced the Soviet Union inherited a bankrupt structure. It inherited commitments that could not be funded, institutions that were not designed for competitive production, and an external debt that demanded hard currency. Even if the new leadership had been perfect, the budget would still have been trapped. So the reforms that followed were not implemented from comfort. They were implemented from desperation. Price controls were removed and prices surged. Subsidies were cut because there was no money to keep them. When prices for essentials rise by extreme multiples, savings evaporate. When savings evaporate, a society that had been trained to trust stability learns the opposite lesson. People do not become cynical because they enjoy cynicism. They become cynical because the system teaches them that belief is expensive. The sequence is consistent with a larger pattern. A commodity windfall funds an oversized structure. A price shock breaks the revenue stream. Borrowing patches the gap. Printing accelerates the loss of trust. Fragmentation follows. The successor state inherits the liabilities and is forced into reforms without a buffer. The pain does not begin at the moment of collapse. It begins years earlier when the incentives reward delay. And the story did not end in 1991. In 1998, Russia defaulted again. The global markets felt it because the world does not isolate financial shocks cleanly. Credit webs transmit stress. Trust, once broken, takes longer to rebuild than leaders expect. Then, in the 2000s, oil prices rose again, and the machine that had once sedated the Soviet system returned in a new form. The revenue stream that had created dependency also offered relief. Debts could be serviced. Obligations could be met. The ledger began to stabilize, not because the underlying lesson had been solved, but because the price of the commodity shifted in a favorable direction again. Eventually, even the long tail of Soviet obligations narrowed into a final payment. The transcript places that final settlement in 2017 with the last remaining Soviet-era debt paid off through a payment to Bosnia-Herzegovina. The dates matter less than the implication. It took decades for the account to close. The Soviet Union died in 1991, but the financial consequences lived on as a real constraint on a different country in a different political system for a generation. If you pull back, the Soviet collapse becomes a clean demonstration of the resource curse, not as a slogan, but as an operating model. Natural resources are not the same as economic strength. They can generate revenue while eroding the incentive to build productive capacity. They can finance stability while discouraging reform. They can create a state that looks unstoppable until the price moves and exposes how much of the structure was held together by one variable. The most unsettling element is how rational each step appears inside its own moment. Subsidize bread because unrest is expensive. Build the military because vulnerability is fatal. Import grain because hunger is politically lethal. Borrow because austerity could break the state immediately. Print because wages must be paid and the alternative is collapse. Each decision makes sense in isolation. As a sequence, it becomes a trap. That is why there is no clean escape at the end of this story. If your stability depends on commodity revenue and imported necessities, reform threatens the very calm it is supposed to preserve. If your legitimacy depends on subsidies, removing them invites rebellion. If your finances depend on trust, admitting weakness can accelerate the run. The system resists change not because leaders are uniquely malicious, but because the structure punishes reform in the short term and rewards survival tactics that worsen the long term. The Soviet Union did not fall because someone flipped a switch called ideology. It fell because a superpower built itself around settlement capacity it did not fully control. It sold oil to buy food. It traded barrels for calm. It treated a temporary windfall as permanent strength. And when the price collapsed, it discovered what power actually is. Power is the ability to keep paying without begging. When that ability disappears, even empires become paperwork. Once you see the Soviet story this way, you start recognizing the pattern as a historical machine. Resource booms masking structural weakness. Borrowing turning crisis into dependency. Money printing turning dependency into mistrust. Fragmentation turning mistrust into dissolution. It does not require villains. It only requires incentives that reward the next short-term patch until there is nothing left to patch with. The collapse feels sudden in memory because symbols fall quickly. Flags come down in minutes. Borders change on paper overnight. But bankruptcy is almost never a single moment. It is a sequence of stages where each step looks reasonable, even necessary, until the accumulated logic becomes impossible to reverse. In the first stage, a state finds a source of effortless external value. For the Soviet Union, oil exports became that value. The crucial detail is not that oil existed. The crucial detail is that oil could be sold for hard currency, and hard currency could purchase what the Soviet system could not reliably produce. That created a shortcut around reform, not because leaders were lazy, but because the incentive structure rewarded stability today more than competitiveness tomorrow. When stability is the currency of survival, leaders buy it. In the second stage, the shortcut becomes policy. Subsidies stop being temporary relief and become the operating system. Cheap bread is no longer an economic decision. It becomes legitimacy. Cheap housing becomes normal. Support for satellite states becomes a demonstration of strength. Military spending becomes a form of insurance against humiliation. The budget stops being a set of flexible choices and turns into a set of permanent commitments. The state writes checks that can only be cashed if the commodity price stays kind. In the third stage, dependency becomes invisible because it becomes routine. Grain imports are no longer treated as a crisis. They are treated as logistics. The country with some of the most fertile land on Earth purchases food abroad because the distribution system cannot be trusted to move harvests efficiently. When nearly half of hard currency earnings are consumed by food imports, the economy is no longer merely inefficient. It is cornered. The superpower is now operating like a household living on one paycheck while paying rent to a rival. In the fourth stage, the external environment shifts, and the system discovers that the paycheck is not guaranteed. Oil prices fall. It does not matter whether the price move is the product of strategy, competition, or coincidence. The mechanism is identical. Revenue collapses while obligations remain. This is where a command economy meets the difference between internal command and external markets. You can command factories. You cannot command global prices. You can command workers to show up. You cannot command foreign sellers to accept a currency they cannot use. In the fifth stage, the state replaces revenue with borrowing because borrowing looks like the least visible compromise. Cutting the military risks the security state. Cutting subsidies risks the public. Cutting support abroad signals weakness. Borrowing postpones pain. It also creates future pain with interest. And when the borrowed money funds consumption rather than productive rebuilding, it does not create a new engine of hard currency. It creates a new obligation that demands hard currency later. In the sixth stage, confidence fails internally and externally at the same time. Internally, printing money allows wages to be paid but does not create goods. Cash accumulates as frustration. Shelves empty as belief collapses. Externally, lenders notice that new debt is being used to service old debt, and they demand stronger guarantees or shorter terms. The state responds by liquidating reserves, selling gold, and seizing hard currency from exporters. Each response is rational as emergency action. Each response destroys trust. When trust dies, the formal economy becomes a theater and the informal economy becomes real. In the seventh stage, politics catches up to cash flow. Republics withhold taxes. Local elites realize that the center cannot punish them reliably if the center cannot pay its own payroll. Financial fragmentation becomes political fragmentation. At this point, even if leadership changes, the structure remains. A new face inherits the same math. This stage pattern is what makes the Soviet story useful beyond its own timeline. It shows collapse as a system behavior, not as an accident. Now consider the viewer's position inside that machine. Not as a citizen of a superpower, but as a person standing in line, watching the promises of a state turn into empty shelves. In a stable system, money is invisible. You hand it over and receive goods. The transaction is so routine that you forget the miracle it represents. In a failing system, money becomes the main character. You feel its weakness every day. You hoard what you can. You trade favors. You learn which store receives deliveries. You learn which official can stamp a paper that unlocks a box. You learn that time in line is not wasted time. It is survival time. In that environment, social status reorders itself around access. Access to foreign currency, access to imported goods, access to transport, access to information about shipments. People who once represented intellectual prestige become poor because prestige does not clear invoices. People who can touch dollars become powerful because dollars still mean something tomorrow. And this is where the documentary needs to linger, because it is the point most histories blur into abstraction. The Soviet Union did not only collapse in ministries and summits, it collapsed in the repeated experience of scarcity. It collapsed in the quiet recognition that the state could no longer uphold its side of the bargain. For decades, many people accepted political limits because the system delivered predictability. When predictability disappeared, the moral argument of the state weakened, not because people suddenly became ideological, because they became hungry, and hunger is not persuaded by slogans. Even the coup attempt in August 1991 makes more sense when framed as a late-stage reaction inside a collapsing system. Hardliners wanted order. They wanted to restore the familiar machinery of control. But control is not enough when the failure is financial. If your crisis is settlement, the tool you need is solvency. The coup offered coercion. It did not offer grain contracts. It did not offer revenue. It did not offer an export engine. It offered the posture of a functioning state, not the function. After the dissolution, the successor state faced a brutal dilemma. To keep subsidies and price controls would require money it did not have. To remove them would detonate public hardship. Shock therapy is often framed as ideology in motion. In the transcript's logic, it is also a budget event. A bankrupt structure cannot finance gradualism. Gradualism costs money. It requires buffers. It requires reserves. It requires time. Bankruptcy removes time. So the pain of the 1990s becomes legible as withdrawal. When subsidies end, prices rise toward reality. When prices rise toward reality, savings that were denominated in a collapsing currency disintegrate. Households lose the stored value of decades. Not because someone personally stole it in a single moment, though corruption exists in every collapse, but because the system of money that stored those savings had lost its anchor years earlier. Once money stops being trusted, savings become a claim on nothing. Then, years later, oil prices rise again, and the pattern completes its circle. Commodity revenue returns, and the state's capacity to pay improves. Debts can be serviced, obligations can be met. The outward appearance of stability returns. This is not a moral resolution. It is a structural reminder. A country built on commodity income can experience dramatic swings in governance capacity without changing its borders at all. The variable is not just leadership. The variable is the revenue stream and what it does to incentives. This is why the final note of the Soviet debt being paid off decades later lands with such weight. The Soviet Union died in 1991. The ledger did not. The ledger outlived the ideology. It outlived the institutions. It outlived the faces on television. It persisted as a real constraint on policy choices for a generation, and that returns us to the coldest line in the entire story. The Soviet Union could project power across continents. It could manufacture fear. It could police speech. But it could not consistently purchase food without the approval of global markets. That is the difference between appearing powerful and being financially sovereign. When the revenue source is external and volatile, and when necessities must be imported in hard currency, sovereignty becomes conditional. Conditional sovereignty is not a conspiracy. It is a design outcome. It is what happens when a state builds its legitimacy on subsidized stability financed by a single export, and then treats that export price as a permanent law of nature. The oil high was never strength. It was borrowed time paid in barrels. The most dangerous part of this pattern is that it does not feel dangerous while it is working. During the boom, the state looks competent because it can fund competence. It looks legitimate because it can purchase calm. It looks respected because it can spend on symbols of respect. And because the revenue is easy, the system begins to confuse a favorable price environment with institutional strength. That confusion is not uniquely Soviet. It is the default failure mode of any structure that receives windfalls without rebuilding its productive core. Windfalls do not arrive with instructions. They arrive with options. Leaders can treat them as temporary and invest in resilience, or they can treat them as permanent and build obligations around them. The Soviet Union did what systems under pressure usually do. It chose the path that minimized immediate risk. It purchased stability. The subtlety is that stability, once subsidized, becomes addictive. The first subsidy calms society. The next subsidy becomes expected. The next subsidy becomes a right. At that point, removing it is not an economic adjustment. It is an identity rupture. The state becomes trapped by the very calm it engineered because citizens and elites organize their lives around the promise that the state will always provide the basics at an artificially low cost. Breaking that promise is politically explosive, so the state does what it did in the late 1980s. It borrows, it sells reserves, it prints, it seizes, it delays. And delay is not neutral. Delay is expensive. Each month purchased with debt increases the future interest burden. Each ruble printed without goods increases the future distrust. Each confiscation of hard currency increases the future concealment. Each of those moves narrows the space available for real reform until the system reaches the moment where reform is no longer a choice and collapse is no longer avoidable. This is why the ending is so bleak even without villains. Nobody needs to be a cartoon monster for the machine to produce ruin. The machine produces ruin because the incentives reward survival tactics until survival tactics become the crisis. That is what happened when the Soviet Union used oil revenue to avoid restructuring industry and agriculture. That is what happened when grain dependency turned hard currency into a food bill. That is what happened when the oil price collapse exposed how much of the state was built on a single number. That is what happened when borrowing replaced revenue and printing replaced credibility. In the final months, the country was no longer arguing about competing futures. It was fighting over shrinking resources. That changes the meaning of politics. In stable systems, politics is ideology plus management. In failing systems, politics becomes distribution. Who gets paid? Who gets fuel? Which region gets deliveries? Which ministry gets the last of the reserves? When that shift happens, every political conflict becomes sharper, because it is no longer about theories, it is about bread. So when the Soviet republics withheld tax revenue, it was not only a quest for national autonomy. It was a rational response to a center that could no longer guarantee anything. When enterprises hid dollars and pushed transactions into the black market, it was not only greed, it was the predictable behavior of actors who had learned that the formal system punished success and the informal system preserved value. When the coup plotters rolled tanks into Moscow, it was not only ideology. It was the reflex of an old model trying to solve a new kind of failure with the only tool it knew: coercion. But coercion cannot restore confidence in currency. It cannot refill reserves. It cannot force global counterparties to accept a unit they do not trust. That is the last cognitive upgrade this story offers, and it is not comforting. A state is a promise enforced by accounting. Its authority is not merely the ability to command, it is the ability to settle. If it cannot settle, it becomes dependent. If it becomes dependent, its options shrink. If its options shrink, its politics radicalize. And when its politics radicalize, its economic capacity deteriorates even faster. The loop feeds itself. This is why the Soviet Union's final image is so instructive. Not the flag, not the speeches, the quiet exhaustion of a government that cannot pay for the next shipment, the humiliation of asking rivals for aid, the inversion of social status where those nearest to foreign cash become powerful, while those who built rockets become poor, the reality that an empire can hold the world at nuclear risk and still be held hostage by the basic requirement of cash flow. There is no clean solution offered at the end of this narrative because the system itself resists clean solutions. Ending dependency requires structural reform. Structural reform requires short-term pain. Short-term pain threatens legitimacy, so leaders avoid it until they cannot. Escaping the trap destabilizes the very stability people depend on. That is why reform is postponed, diluted, rebranded, or abandoned, not always out of malice, but out of fear of what happens if the subsidies stop and the shelves stay empty. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it forgot how to be feared. It collapsed because fear does not purchase grain. It collapsed because hard currency does not care about ideology. It collapsed because a commodity windfall made the system feel rich enough to ignore its own weaknesses until the weaknesses became the only thing left. And when you look at the 20th century through that lens, the Cold War's ending stops looking like a cinematic victory. It looks like the last page of a ledger, not conquered, not redeemed, bankrupt. If there is one final image worth keeping, it is not the Kremlin at dusk. It is the dock, the ship offshore, the cargo waiting. The radio message that says nothing moves until the payment clears. Because that is what a modern state ultimately is. a clearing mechanism, a settlement layer, a way of converting promises into deliveries. The Soviet Union built a superpower that could terrify the planet, but it financed daily life with an arrangement that demanded constant external approval. Oil exports created hard currency. Hard currency bought grain. Grain preserved social calm. Social calm preserved political control. Political control preserved the empire. Each link looked stable until one number broke the chain. This is why the fall does not belong to one man, one speech, or one plot. It belongs to a structure that rewarded postponement. It belongs to a windfall treated as destiny. It belongs to a legitimacy model that depended on subsidized stability, and an economic model that depended on selling raw materials to purchase the basics of modern life. And once you understand that, the end of the Cold War becomes less mythic and more surgical. The decisive pressure was not only military, it was financial. It was the slow tightening of a hard currency constraint, until the state could not continue the simplest routine of governance: pay wages, buy food, keep the shelves credible, keep the promises believable. And that is the darkest irony. The system did not fail because it lacked power. It failed because it lacked liquidity. It failed because its currency could not travel. It failed because the outside world did not have to defeat it in battle to defeat it in practice. It only had to wait until the bills arrived and the reserves ran out. So the Soviet flag did not simply fall, it settled.